Dear Father in heaven, we are very thankful that we can be here this morning or evening, depending where we are. We are thankful for the words of Scripture, for the prophecies, for the way that you have led in the past your people throughout history. We're also thankful, Lord, for the chastening that you have done in our lives. We know, Lord, that there's much that we need to learn, not just intellectually, but also spiritually. We ourselves have a desire to follow you, but we know the Spirit is indeed willing, but the flesh is weak. We pray for our church. We pray for this movement. We pray for the individuals, and also the individuals that we come in contact with, that we share truth with. We ask now for your Spirit to be here as we open your word together, as we continue our study on the two sticks. And we just ask, Lord, that the things we learn will stick with us and that we can share them with others. Be with each one here again, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, welcome back, everyone. This is the third part of the study on the two sticks. And just in a very quick review, we came to learn that there was this structure of chiasms that existed first in the 430 years, but even maybe first just in the animals in Genesis 15, when Abram made the covenant with God. And we looked at that 430-year chiasm. We also looked at the chiasm in the story of Joseph. And we come to the end of that chiasm, and in some of our other studies, we're dealing with that in more detail, the story of the Exodus and so forth. But now what we want to look at is the prophetic mirror itself and look at the start of it, because this is really, when you talk about the joining of the two sticks, as we saw when we read in Ezekiel 37, that there was a reference one stick. So I'll just maybe go to this passage just as a review. So we go there. So this is Ezekiel 37. It says, "Moreover, thou son of man, take thee one stick and write upon it for Judah, and for the children of Israel his companions. Then take another stick and write upon it for Joseph, the stick of Ephraim, and for all the house of Israel his companions, and join them one to another into one stick, and they shall become one in thine hand." So this idea of these two sticks, and that they can be joined together, is something that, we're not really, very common with or very familiar with. It's not a common study. I haven't really ever heard of the joining of the two sticks in regular Adventism. So I find it a little bit odd, because we've studied it in this message, but even in this message, it's only been a cursory part of this message. And I think it's actually an essential part of this message to understand this. Now, we see that the two sticks, one's Judah and one's Joseph. And so going back to the story of Joseph, we can see that when the first example of this is when Judah sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites. So he was sold into slavery, and then they were joined again after a period of 22 years. And 220 and 22 are a symbol of restoration. And so we have in our history the joining of the two sticks that's going to occur. But it also occurs other places in Israelite history. And so in order to look at the prophetic mirror that we're going to look at, there's still some background information that's often not well understood. So we're going to try to go through that as well. And we'll look at the notes here. So obviously, I just kind of reviewed this. We have the story of Joseph that gives us this idea of these mirrors, 430 years, the 22 years, divided 11 and 11, or you could even add the 17 years at the beginning, at the end of that prophetic mirror. These are chronological mirrors and are not well understood by many other people. Other people notice them, but they don't really understand the significance of them. So it's not like we're the first people who noticed that there's a mirror that exists, but the significance of them has not been well understood. So in order to understand the two sticks, we're going to look at these idea of these lines. So we're going to take the one stick in this context as being Israel, which is the line of Samaria, and another line being Judah, which is the line of Jerusalem. And the fact that Samaria and Jerusalem are mentioned really go back to Isaiah chapter 7 at the start of this. And so we're going to try to slowly go through it. And I haven't really known how I'm going to approach this because there's so much detail that I could really get us bogged down. But the way that it happened for me, I guess, is part of it. So let's read these verses, and I think this will help as we go through, kind of see where we're going. It says in 2 Kings 21, verse 11 to 13, because Manasseh, king of Judah, hath done these abominations, and hath done wickedly above all that the Amorites did, which were before him, and hath made Judah also to sin with his idols. Therefore thus saith the Lord God of Israel, behold, I am bringing such evil upon Jerusalem and Judah, that whosoever heareth of it, both his ears shall tingle. I will stretch over Jerusalem the line of Samaria, and the plummet of the house of Ahab, and I will wipe Jerusalem as a man wipeth a dish, wiping it and turning it upside down. So this passage in 2 Kings 21, verse 11 to 13, talks about this line of Samaria, and obviously this other, we're going to stretch over Jerusalem, the line of Samaria. That means that what happened to Samaria is going to happen to Jerusalem. Now, I sort of left some of this passage out, and I think I should probably read a little bit ahead of this in 1 Kings. Let me see. That was 21. Yes. Is it 1 Kings or 2 Kings? 2 Kings 21. Yes, that makes more sense. Okay, so 2 Kings chapter 21. And it starts with this story about Manasseh in verse 21:11. Because Manasseh king of Judah hath done these abominations, and hath done wickedly above all that the Amorites did, which were before him, and hath made Judah to sin in his idols. Therefore thus saith the Lord God of Israel, behold, I am bringing such evil upon Jerusalem and Judah, that whosoever heareth of it, both his ears shall tingle. Now, I'm going to go back even before that, because this is all, if you're reading this here, this is about Manasseh. So it starts with Manasseh's 12 years old when he begins to reign, so in verse 1, and reigned 55 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Hephzibah. We're going to come back to this. The meaning of his mom's name and the significance of it. But we see that there's this Manasseh who's very, very wicked. And We also know that Manasseh is the one who's taken into captivity. So if we turn to 2 Chronicles 33, 2 Chronicles 33, verse 11, and wherefore the Lord brought upon them the captains of the Lord's host, captains of the host of the king of Assyria, which took Manasseh among the thorns, and brought him with fetters and carried him unto Babylon. So the Lord brought upon them the captains of the hosts of the kings of Assyria, which took Manasseh among thorns and bound him with fetters and carried him to Babylon. So we know, I'm going to stop sharing here and go to the whiteboard. So we know that Manasseh was taken captive. And in the context here, it says that this is a line, but they're going to put the line of Samaria over the line of Jerusalem. So I'm going to go like this. So here you got the line of Samaria, and you have the line of Jerusalem. So these are the two cities, the capital of northern Israel, sometimes referred to as Ephraim, because that's where the city of Samaria is, which is also the largest of the 10 northern tribes. And then the capital of Judah. Judah is the largest of the 2 southern tribes, Judah and Benjamin. And so these are these capital cities. And so judgment is being waged upon Jerusalem just as it was upon Samaria. Now with Samaria, we know that Hoshea was taken captive. And this was in 723 BC. And Manasseh was taken captive in 677. And we're going to deal with these evidences here as well. So we have these two lines. And they start both with the captivity of the king, and then there's going to be events that follow. With Samaria, it's a little bit different than with Jerusalem. Jerusalem has a very specific series of events that we can date. With Samaria, they're more clustered together. So we have this line of Samaria that's going to be stretched over Jerusalem, or stretching over Jerusalem, the line of Samaria. So it's going to be stretched over. So that means Samaria has happened first. So that's one of the things that we would learn by that. So basically what's happened to Samaria is going to happen to Jerusalem. And so we know that Samaria first occurs based on that context. So the relationships of these prophecies are part of the understanding. So usually when I'm presenting this, the prophetic mirror here at the beginning, I'm not going to be presenting it in the traditional way that we have done it. I'm going to first focus upon, because we have different ways that we can look at this. We can look at it from Miller's understanding of the 25-20, where we take 25-20 years and we just create these periods of time. And then later on, we first show maybe Miller's 25-20 from 677 to 1843, 1844. And then we show Hiram Edson's suggestion that there's these two desolating 1260 years for paganism and papalism. The two desolating powers have their own 25-20, and that Miller's 25-20 wasn't correct, but we now put them together, we get the prophetic mirror in that way. And I don't quite do it that way because what I want to look at is focus more upon the 65-year prophecy at the beginning and really establish what's happening as far as its relationship to the book of Leviticus. So there's different ways that I do it depending on whom I'm teaching. So I wrote here, to understand this prophecy, we must understand its context and its relation to the prophecy or line that is spoken of in regards to Samaria. Hoshea, the last king of northern Israel, was taken captive in 723 BC by the Assyrian king Shalmaneser V, just prior to a 2-year siege that ended in the destruction of Samaria in 721 BC by Shalmaneser's successor Sargon II. Over 40 years later, the Assyrian king Esarhaddon repopulated that land with the people who later became known as the Samaritans. These events were the fulfillment of the prophecy by Isaiah that proclaimed, "For within 65 years shall Ephraim be broken, that it be not a people." The events also fulfill the prophecy of Leviticus 26 that lays out a progressive destruction of 4 chastisements: king, people, land, city, and final scattering, that are to fall upon God's people for the transgression of the sabbatical rest of the land. The first of these chastisements is the breaking of the pride of power, which resulted in the captivity of their king in 723 BC. This is where the line of Samaria begins. And so to understand this, when we first came to understand these 2 lines together, we recognize that the starting point, which William Miller himself gives, is 742 BC, the 65-year prophecy. And we're going to have to look at that in a little bit more detail. So let's take a look at this. Now, I'm going to read what I've written here because it's a bit more succinct than I usually can do speaking. It says, the background of the 65-year prophecy is a civil war known as the Syro-Ephraimitic War between the northern kingdom of Israel, referred to here as Ephraim, and the southern kingdom of Judah. During the last year of the reign of Jotam's, that's Ahaz's father, we are told that in those days the Lord began to send against Judah Rezin the king of Syria and Pekah the son of Remaliah. And that's 2 Kings 15:37. This conflict was the inheritance of Ahaz. At the beginning of his reign, Isaiah was sent to give him a message. Rather than trust in the king of Assyria as an ally, the Lord assures Ahaz that the confederacy of Pekah and Rezin will not succeed. In fact, Israel as a nation and people will not exist beyond the allotted 65-year period. It came to pass in the days of Ahaz that Rezin, king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, king of Israel, so this is Isaiah 7, verse 1 to 9, went up toward Jerusalem to war against it, but could not prevail against it. And it was told the house of David, saying, Syria is confederate with Ephraim. And his heart was moved, and the heart of his people, as the trees of the wood are moved with the wind. Then said the Lord unto Isaiah, Go forth now to meet Ahaz, thou and Shear-Jashub, thy son, at the end of the conduit of the upper pool in the highway of the fuller's field. And say unto him, Take heed and be quiet, fear not, neither be faint-hearted, for the 2 tails of these smoking firebrands, for the fierce anger of Rezin with Syria, and of the son of Remaliah, because Syria, Ephraim, and the son of Remaliah have taken counsel against thee, saying, Let us go up against Judah, and vex it, and let us make a breach therein for us, and set a king in the midst of it, even the son of Tabeel. Thus saith the Lord God, It shall not stand, neither shall it come to pass. For the head, so that word is Rosh in Hebrew, refers here to the capital of Syria, is Damascus, and the head, in this context, is the king of Damascus, is Rezin. So, and we'll look at this in a bit more detail, the importance of this structure. And within 65 years shall Ephraim be broken, that it be not a people. And the head, capital of Ephraim, is Samaria, and the head, king of Samaria, is Remaliah's son, who is Pekah. If ye will not believe, surely ye shall not be established. So it talks here a number of things about the within 65 years. It has these different people. And if we have all these names thrown at us, but here we presented with a cast of characters that must be sorted out. We got Rezin, who rules Syria from the city of Damascus, Pekah, who rules northern Israel from the city of Samaria, Ahaz, the king of Judah, and Isaiah, with his son Shear-Jashub, coming to meet Ahaz and warning him of the confederacy to overthrow his kingship by placing the son of Tabeel upon the throne of Judah and assuring him that this confederacy would not stand. Now, in trying to understand the problem that arises here, or maybe it's not really a problem, but it's just the way that people usually look at it, and people who criticize this, is on the surface, this appears to be a 65-year prophecy about northern Israel. It talks about Ephraim in this context. Within 65 years shall Ephraim be broken. Now, part of the problem is the translation. The word within, that's translated in the English, there's nothing necessarily wrong with translating it as in. But it doesn't really mean that just sometime within a period of time that this is going to happen. And we take it that way. We say, well, it was within 65 years and it happened in 19 years. But the word actually really means an iteration. It means again in. So what it's saying is that what's going to happen to Ephraim in this next 65 years is going to happen again. And in the context here, Isaiah is giving this message to Ahaz. Ahaz, the king of Judah. So the prophecy isn't really about Israel. Now it is, because there's things that are going to happen to Israel. And so in assuring the king of Judah, he's saying that they're not going to be a people, that there's this period of 65 years. But he's also warning Ahaz at the same time. So Ahaz is concerned about this immediate threat, and God talks about this longer period of time, 65 years. Well, Ahaz probably isn't going to be alive at the end of 65 years. But God is assuring him that if he believes the prophets, that he would, be supported by God. But it says, if ye believe not, surely ye shall not be established. So he's basically taking what's going to happen to Israel as a warning to Ahaz and to his house. Now, if we just stop there, we might not see this as clearly as we should. And that's why we have to look at the next part of Isaiah chapter 7 and really understand the full context of what's being talked about. So it says here, Ahaz is not pleased, however, with this assurance. He is unenthusiastic due to his plan to align himself with the king of Assyria against the confederacy of Syria and Ephraim. The Lord requests that Ahaz ask him for a sign. Ahaz refuses, hiding his plans with the pretense of deference. God sees through his response and expands upon the prophecy already given. So Isaiah gives this message to Ahaz, and God recognizes that Ahaz's response is really insincere. He has these plans to go to the king of Assyria. He doesn't really need God to protect him from northern Israel. He has some kind of idea. He's probably been paying money maybe to the king of Assyria and as part of a protection racket, and feels that he'll be safe. I don't know if that's exactly what's happening, but he believes that the king of Assyria is going to save him. So we go on, Isaiah continues, and he says, "Hear ye now, O house of David." So now he's addressing Judah as the house of David. Now, house of David is, of course, the kingship. All the kings of Judah are of the house of David. So he's addressing Ahaz, but not in a sense personally. He's addressing this whole house of David. "Is it a small thing for you to weary men, but will ye weary my God also? Therefore the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Butter and honey shall he eat, that ye may know to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the child shall know to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land that thou abhorrest shall be forsaken of both her kings. And the Lord shall bring upon thee, and upon thy people, and upon thy father's house, days that have not come, from the day that Ephraim departed from Judah, even the king of Assyria. So most Christians are going to take this first verse, the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel, as a messianic prophecy. That is, they will be reading this passage, maybe they're reading Isaiah 7, and then all of a sudden this passage jumps out at them, and because it's quoted in the New Testament as a prophecy concerning Christ, they then take this statement out of its context and say, this is a prophecy about Christ. Now, in the context of chapter 7 and chapter 8, this can't possibly be talking about Jesus. First off, the context is this 65-year prophecy. So it has to have some bearing upon that prophecy. It has to have a bearing upon this battle, and also the king of Assyria. Because it's going to say right later on that the king of Assyria is going to come. Now we know Assyria is gone by the time of Christ. So just reading this prophecy this way, we do it a lot as Christians. And because what we're doing is we're making an application. And I have to say something about this. In this movement, we had for a short time this idea being presented that eventually turned into dispensationalism. And it was a misuse of dispensationalism, and it was a misuse of this principle. And because I understood this principle that you need, when you're reading a passage, you need to understand how it was interpreted and fulfilled in its immediate context in order to make an application to the future. This truth, which often many Christians don't know, many Adventists don't really understand fully, it's misused in lots of different ways. It's misused in dispensationalism, Christian dispensationalism, where they don't really take at all the importance of a passage. And we might even say that it's used in proof texting, but proof texting is fine. When you read Hebrews chapter 1, the Apostle Paul takes all these statements that aren't in the immediate context about Jesus and applies them to Christ. So we can do that. The danger comes, there's two different extremes, if you want to put it that way. You can have this preterist view where you just say everything is understood in its immediate context, and any application that we make to the future is merely the lessons that we can learn from it. We can't apply any prophecies from the past to the future. And then we have this other sort of more mystical approach, which is sort of the Pentecostal approach, where we read verses in the Old Testament and in the New Testament even, and we just make these applications willy-nilly without any consideration of context. We can apply something to our own life. We read a verse because we're praying to God about something, and then we just apply that verse to ourselves. Or in a futuristic sense, we can just take prophecies without understanding how they were fulfilled at all originally, and we can just take time elements of those prophecies. We can take all kinds of things about those prophecies, all the different symbols, and just give them our own interpretation of what's going to happen in the end. Now, as Seventh-day Adventist, and as William Miller studied, he always took into consideration what the verse was about. He didn't just make an application. Now, sometimes it may appear that he does in a certain way, but he just assumes that everybody understands the steps that he's going through. So when he, for instance, he does the 25-20 years, starting in 677 and ending in 1843, 1844, he doesn't just see 7 times and make this application. He understands that the context is the sabbatical cycle. So he's not just taking 7 times and saying 7 times is 7 years, and we multiply it by 360, and then we're going to just come to this date. He has already worked out that that the sabbatical cycle has a symbolic application. And when he applies it, even his starting point to take Manasseh, he actually is using Isaiah chapter 7. So he looks at how the prophecy is worded, and then he tries to make an application of it, of what happened to Israel. Now, he skips the literal application of the 70 years and so forth. And you can think, well, then he probably didn't understand that. But I think he did understand it. He just thought that everybody else also understood it, that if we're looking at a prophecy at the end of the world, we're not going to be now dealing with literal Israel. We're going to be dealing with spiritual Israel. But the thing is, there's details in the prophecy that he missed because he didn't spend the time on what happened to literal Israel. So he wasn't making a mistake. He wasn't wrong. It's just that he missed out on a lot of details because he skipped some steps. He knew those steps were there, but he didn't get the details from them. So when it comes to this, applying this to Christ, in order to apply this to Christ, like the New Testament writers do, is to understand that there's actually a literal application of this, that the child that's going to be born to a virgin is going to be a type of Christ. Now, there's another point here that Christians have argued for a long time about whether this is a virgin or whether this is just a young lady that is being talked about. Now, if you look at the context, there's an obvious understanding of who this virgin is. It's not a person. It's the same woman that we see in Revelation chapter 12, who's clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars. This virgin is Israel. It's the church. It's not a person. Now, when an application is made by the New Testament writers that this virgin is then a woman, that's a proper application of it, because that woman, Mary, is a daughter and a descendant of King David. She is a woman from which the promised seed back in Genesis chapter 3 is supposed to come. So there's sort of a dual application or dual way in which you can look at this. You can look at the literal application here, if you want to call it literal, but the local application, the immediate application, is to Ahaz, and it's about the house of David. And this virgin is going to become a type of Christ, or of Christ's mother. So it's going to this son that's going to be born to this virgin is going to be a type of Christ. But this son is not Christ in the immediate context. And so we can find out who this is because it tells us. So one is it gives us a period of 65 years, but it also tells us this next part that we often misunderstand. So it says, butter and honey shall he eat, that he may know to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the child shall know to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land that thou abhorrest shall be forsaken of both her kings. Now, a lot of commentaries, they will apply this, the land that thou abhorrest shall be forsaken of both her kings. They apply the kings to the land that he abhors, thinking that this land is northern Israel and Syria. And of course, northern Israel and Syria are not a land. They're two separate places. And the abhorring of the land is misunderstood as well. So this would refer to the reality that the land has not been treated properly by the kings of Judah and Israel. So the land has been abhorred. They hate it. They fear it. They disregard it. And this virgin also is the land, because the virgin refers to the church or the people of God and the land upon which they live. So they're closely connected. And so it says that the land that thou abhorrest is going to be forsaken of both her kings. And this has to happen before the child that's going to be born is going to be converted. Butter and honey are terms used in affliction. That is, when you have a land that's depopulated, the only thing to eat is honey, and because the cattle are still there, butter. But you have no crops. So this is referring to a type of affliction that occurs because of the depopulation of the land, because of the captivity. And Manasseh himself is going to be the one that's going to fulfill this prophecy. So that could be a question to people, because we have here, the land's going to be forsaken of both their kings before the child can know to choose the good and refuse the evil. So first, northern Israel has Hoshea taken captive. And then we're going to see, and we're going to deal with some of this chronology as well. And then we see that Manasseh is taken captive. So this is the child that has to be converted. And we know that Manasseh is a wicked king, and he goes through a conversion process because of what happens to him when he's carried to Assyria, to Babylon, specifically by the king of Assyria. And this is the only way this prophecy actually makes sense if you look at it locally. Now, the Jews, in trying to understand this prophecy, they would usually try to say that the child that's going to be born is Hezekiah, which is Manasseh's father. The problem with that, when you look at the chronology, Hezekiah is already born at the time that this prophecy comes to Ahaz. So Hezekiah is not going to be born in the future. But we also have some other clues about this. So we did read, dealing with Manasseh in 2 Kings chapter 21, that his mother's name was Hephzibah. But now we can also look to Isaiah, and he's going to talk about this. I think this will make it a little bit clearer. So if we go to Isaiah, I believe it's chapter 62. Yes. So thou shalt also be a crown of glory in the hand of the Lord, and a royal diadem in the house of thy God. Thou shalt no more be termed forsaken, neither shall thy land any more be termed desolate, but thou shalt be called Hephzibah, and thy land Beulah. For the Lord delighteth in thee, and thy land shall be married. So here we have now this reference to Hephzibah, which is the mother of Manasseh. And so she becomes typically a symbol of the land. More specifically, when you look at this, it says, no more shall you be termed forsaken. So this is talking about really the people. Neither shall thy land any more be termed desolate. This is really the land. But thou shalt be called Hephzibah. That's the people, the daughter of Zion, right? And thy land Beulah. For the Lord delighteth in thee, and thy land shall be married. For as a young man marrieth a virgin, so shall thy sons marry thee. And as a bridegroom rejoiceth over the bride, so shall thy God rejoice over thee. So in just this idea, because this is about Jerusalem, for Jerusalem's sake I will not rest until the righteousness thereof go forth as brightness, and the salvation thereof as a lamp that burneth. So this is in Isaiah chapter 62 about their coming salvation. But we can see here this illustration of the land and the church being a virgin. And I did mention Revelation chapter 12. And I think that this is something that really should be obvious to us, because we don't take the woman here. It says in 12 verse 1, and there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. And she, being with child, cried, travailing in birth and pain to be delivered. And there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his heads. Right? And we know his description, and it says, he was ready, the dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered, and to devour her child as soon as it was born. And she brought forth a man-child, who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up unto God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness. Well, we know here that this is not talking about Mary, where she had a place prepared of God, and they should feed her there 1,260 days. So this is talking about a period of 1,260 years, from 538 to 1798. So the woman here is the church. And so why we would go back to Isaiah chapter 7 and then try to apply that directly to Christ, especially in the immediate context of the prophecy. I mean, it's just that we're a little bit blinded. We have these blinders on just because we've seen that verse, we've heard of it, and then we don't really need to argue about it. It's pretty clear that it is a virgin, because the church is compared to a virgin. So that's part of the issue there when you're in Isaiah 7, is that we need to understand this sign, what it is. And so the sign is not the birth of the child, even though, it says, behold, the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive a barren son and call his name Emmanuel. Butter and honey he shall eat, that he may know to refuse the evil and choose the good. The sign is, before the child shall know to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land that thou abhorrest shall be forsaken of both her kings. And then, when it says he shall bring upon you the king of Assyria, and you go reading through it, you realize that there has to be an immediate context of this. And it says in verse 22, it shall come to pass, for the abundance of milk that they shall give, he shall eat butter. For butter and honey shall everyone eat that is left in the land. So this is talking about a captivity. And it shall come to pass in that day that every place shall be where there were 1,000 vines at 1,000 silverlings, it shall be for briars and thorns. So, and even the verse 20, in the same day shall the Lord shave with a razor that is hired, namely by them beyond the river, by the king of Assyria, the head, and the hair of the feet, and it also shall consume the beard. So there's all this about Assyria, but we just take this verse and we ignore its actual application. Now, if you want to study this more, I would read through Isaiah 8 as well, because this is really just a continuation of Isaiah 7. It might be, I'm not sure if it's spoken at the same time, but I think it's another prophecy, but it continues with the Assyrian invasion. And it's interesting here. It says, moreover, the Lord said unto me, take thee a great roll and write in it with a man's pen concerning Maher-shalal-Hashbaz. And Maher-shalal-Hashbaz, his name means quick to the spoil, hasten to the prey, something like that. But what we miss is this great roll. And if you look up this word, it's actually a mirror. They're going to write on a mirror. So it's not a roll of leather. It's not a parchment. It's not paper. It's not stone. It's actually a mirror. So it's not a roll, even though it's translated that way. And so he's going to write on this mirror. And so we can see that this is talking about a mirror. Now, when we talk about this, before we talked about the 65 years being an iteration, again in 65 years. And we now have this mirror. We can see that all of these events here at the beginning are to be understood as referring to something that's going to happen now, but also is going to be repeated later. So the idea of the Civil War, when we repeat it at the end of this prophetic mirror, it's all built into the language of this prophecy. And so it's going to talk here about the king of Assyria coming in chapter 8. And there's lots of interesting verses. One is this is a battle about the king of the north and the king of the south. But of course, it's not the same context as in Daniel chapter 11, but it illustrates it. And so this is the first real battle about between the king of the north and the king of the south. We could also, I guess, go back to 977 when northern and southern Israel split. So that was like a revolution. And now we're in a civil war period in 672. So it took 235 years for the divided kingdom to finally come into a civil war. And then 235 months later, they began their 25-20, because 19 years, as we'll see, is 235 months. So the first 235 years are followed by 235 months. So anyway, you can go on and read this. I'm not going to go into this in detail. But what we see is we have these 65 years at the beginning. So if we place Isaiah's prophecy back here, so we now got this year here, 742 BC. 742 BC, we have Ahaz. We find that there's 19 years between here. So this is going to be a civil war. And it's a war between the north and the south. But the north is Confederate. So there's this confederation on the north. And it talks about how they will not be a people, not established, and this is referring to the land of Israel and the people of Israel. So these two are both tied together. So all this here happens in 742 BC. Now, the way that it was always done is we would just go over here and we'd go to 1844. And we just say that this is 25-20 years. And then we would go here to 1798. And this is 25-20 years. And so here's the line of Samaria being stretched over the line of Jerusalem. And this is just a simple way to look at it. Now we see here Manasseh's captivity, and we're going to look at this in more detail. So how you're going to present this to people, a lot depends on how much they understand, how much time you have. So this, pardon me, I'm putting this wrong here. Let's do it. So you got 19 years here, and then this is 65 years. I'll just do it this way. So you got the 19 years and the 65 years, and then the same thing at the end. We're going to put 19 years here, which is 1863, and then we're going to also end this here with the 65 years. So this is 1863 as well. We'll do it like this. So there's different ways you can draw this out. But you can see there's the 65-year prophecy, and what's happened to northern Israel is going to be stretched over Jerusalem, but it's going to happen at the end of 65 years because the land has to be forsaken of both her kings. So the 65 years is not specifically referring to Israel. Now, it was understood by many people, and you'll see this in some commentaries, is that they assume this 65 years have to do with Israel, and they will place it here as when the land gets repopulated by Esarhaddon. So Esarhaddon does do that. It's not necessarily in the year 677, though. This we can date specifically to 677. When he repopulates the land, we know it's during his reign, and his reign is a period of about 10 years. Manasseh's comes sort of 4 years into it, that he's taken captive by Esarhaddon. So not everybody's familiar with all this history. Many of us don't understand the history of the fall of northern Israel, until we start studying the 25-20. We're definitely not going to understand much about who Manasseh is. and who took him captive. So people, when they attack this, the thing that they will do first is they will attack the dates. And these are easy to do. So you can always find different dates for everything. So all you do is you find some authority that has some different date than what we've given here. And to that person, that's enough to discredit the 2520. The problem is you can find different dates for everything. 457 BC, for the 7th year of Artaxerxes, you're going to have people with different dates. You're going to have different dates for basically everything in the Bible, when all the kings reigned. So the fact that somebody can do that, you need to be able to defend against that. Then also, when you look at this history, in our message, we had this misunderstanding, at least I did, and I think many other people did, that 723 was the fall of Samaria. So here's the fall of Samaria itself. So Samaria's fall happens in 721 BC. But then even again, if you look up most commentators, they'll say 722 BC for the fall of Samaria. And that in some ways just a compromised date. But when they say 722, they're actually putting the fall of Samaria in December of 722. And they ignore the fact that Sargon II, when he comes to the throne, he finishes off this captivity here in 721 in the spring. And in order to get all this to work, and I've worked through it many, many times, what you find is that, and we're going to look at these verses, but Hoshea's captivity happens 2 years before Samaria falls. And the Bible says it's 3 years. So we're going to look at that right now. And then we're going to deal with this period of time. Now, I'm going through this rather slowly. If anybody has any questions, I definitely would appreciate them. But it is something that, we just sort of take for granted. And I never like that we just take for granted some date in our message. I know when I first started studying the 2520, I had to personally figure this all out because I had to answer people. And it wasn't good enough for me to just say, well, this authority says 742 for Ahaz, or, this authority says 723 for the fall of Samaria, which is what I thought started the 2520, not the captivity of Hoshea 2 years before. Or, I find a source that says 677 for Manasseh's captivity. Wasn't enough for me because I actually had to explain it to people who were opposed to the message. And some of them wanted solid answers. That is, they said it makes sense, but when I look up this date, I'm getting other dates. Can you help me? So that was actually how I got into such a deep study on the 2520 and the chronology, even though I'd always been interested in chronology. In order to sort out the mess of the kings of Judah, it took me about 2 years. And that was full-time study. So 40, 50 hours a week, reading, answering questions, writing, and trying to work out all these different puzzles. And I hadn't even, that's just the kings, basically the kings of Judah and Israel and the Babylonian captivity. There was a lot more chronology that I needed to figure out that I hadn't even figured out in that first 2 years of study. And so we're going to look at some of these evidences that are important. So go back to the notes. So one of the things, I have this in a footnote here. So I just want to deal with 742. I thought of writing 742 source book and a 723 source book and a 677 source book, where you bring all the different resources together, all the different statements. You write a short article about that year and how you put together, and then you have all the sources. I just haven't had time. So I'll share you the screen here again, and let's just look at these this footnote here. I don't know if you can read it too well, but it says, we're not given the year of Ahaz's reign, but only told that it is in the days of Ahaz. So when you start with Isaiah chapter 7, it says in the days of Ahaz. Yet we know this is his accession year. For one, he had just inherited the conflict from his father Jotham. And for another, the length of the conflict was about 3 years. It does not allow for the following events and their accordant prophecies to fit, unless it is just near the beginning of his reign. And that's the only thing that makes sense. So when Isaiah comes to Ahaz, he's talking about this civil war. The civil war started in the days of Ahaz's father, just at the end of his reign. So Ahaz is somewhat familiar with it because it just started. So it couldn't be later on in his reign. And I've had people say, well, it says in the days of Ahaz, so it could be anywhere in his reign. And of course, that's not possible, because we know that in the years of his reign, there's only 3 years where Pekah is alive. Pekah ends up being killed by Hoshea. So there's just a short period of time. And then also the prophecies themselves, they have time elements to them. There's going to be a woman that's going to have a child. So all these different things have to happen within this period of time in order for the prophecies to make any sense. But people will often argue those types of things. I'm not saying that you can convince them, because I haven't been able to convince people who are really opposed to it. But people who actually have interest in it and are trying to answer it, sometimes for others, but sometimes even for themselves. And so I deal with this 65-year prophecy. And I'm skipping some of this here, some of the stuff from my notes. And I think I'm looking mostly at my footnotes. Okay, so and I'm going to come back to 723 a bit later. Maybe I'll do 723 first, because I'll do it in chronological order. So we dealt with 742, and that's just my basic argument, is that it's 742, it's the beginning of his reign. It doesn't really answer when his reign starts as far as the chronology is concerned. There's other ways that I deal with that. But this is from the Cambridge Bible, the book of the prophet Isaiah. It says probably no single passage of, okay, that's dealing with Isaiah's prophecy. Let's go to 2 Chronicles 29, 12 to 13. That's where we want to go. So 2 Chronicles has an interesting history that we have studied in this message. So it's an important part of this. Now this is when Hezekiah begins his reign, and there's some details here that we're obviously not going to be able to address completely. But basically, when Hezekiah begins to reign, he starts to, he's following God. And it says in the first year of his reign, in the first month, he opened the doors of the house of the Lord and repaired them. And he brought in the priests and the Levites and gathered them together into the east street. So Hezekiah does this, where he restores the true worship, and they clean out the temple. And this has happened in other periods in the history of Judah. And this is where we have the priests and the Levites are going to cleanse this temple. And we can, in going through this to try to date this time, Hezekiah is 25 years old. Let me see here. We go. There's a bunch here to read. I don't want to read it all. So they end up cleaning out the temple. I think it might be in chapter 30. So he restores temple worship. And they do 8 days cleansing the temple and 8 days the courtyard. So this is a symbol of the priests and Levites. And so they consecrate the temple, all these different offerings. And it just happened, as it says in verse 36, it was done suddenly. So when we go to chapter 30, the next chapter, this is the part I wanted. And Hezekiah sent to all Israel and Judah and wrote letters also to Ephraim and Manasseh, that they should come to the house of the Lord at Jerusalem to keep the Passover unto the Lord God of Israel. So this is actually going to be a Passover that's in the second month, because they cleansed the temple in 16 days. They've already passed the Passover. They start on the first day of the first month, and they go to the 16th day of the first month. So, but now they're going to make this invitation to all Israel and Judah, and wrote letters also to Ephraim and Manasseh. So they've written these letters to the northern kingdom as well, inviting them to this celebration of the Passover. So one of the things this means is that the northern kingdom exists. When you look at chronologies that try to tell you the shorter period of the chronology, which is Edwin Thiele's chronology, Edwin Thiele rejects that this happened in the way that Ellen White says it happened. That is, this is just before Samaria is going to fall. It's going to fall in a couple of years. It's going to begin, a siege is going to begin, and then they're going to be destroyed. And this is their offer that's being made from Judah to the northern kingdom. Now, in the context of the joining of the two sticks, this is extremely important, because we have these two sticks. They've had this civil war earlier under King Ahaz. Hezekiah comes to the throne. He restores the true worship in Jerusalem, and then he makes an invitation to northern Israel to come worship the Lord in Jerusalem. So this invitation parallels the invitation that we're giving now. So we're, one is we have priests and Levites, but we're also going to be giving an invitation to the world, to the Protestants, to northern Israel, because the Seventh-day Adventist Church is Judah, and northern Israel is represented by the Protestant churches. For the king had taken counsel, and his princes and all the congregation in Jerusalem, to keep the Passover in the second month, for they could not keep it at that time, because the priests had not sanctified themselves sufficiently, neither had the people gathered themselves together in Jerusalem. So there's this invitation to everyone from Beersheba even unto Dan, which is an important phrase. There's lots dealing with that I'm not going to touch on. Now, when you go to 2 Kings, it's going to deal with the reign of Hezekiah, and it's going to deal with the captivity of Hoshea. So Hoshea would be the king in northern Israel, and we're going to look at the timing of these two kings. So I believe we go to chapter 17 first. So in chapter 17 of 2 Kings, it says, in the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, began Hoshea, the son of Elah, to reign in Samaria over Israel 9 years. So Hoshea begins to reign in Samaria, and he reigns for 9 years. And he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, but not as the kings of Israel that were before him. Against him came up Shalmaneser, king of Assyria. It's actually Shalmaneser the fifth. And Hoshea became his servant and gave him presents. So Shalmaneser comes. He makes Hoshea a servant of him. And when it says it gives him gifts, he's paying tribute to Shalmaneser, this protection racket that existed in the Middle East at that time. And then it says, and the king of Assyria found conspiracy in Hoshea, for he had sent messengers to So, king of Egypt. So Egypt and Assyria, for a long time, are in this conflict, and the land of Palestine and Israel, Judah, the Levant, is between these two powers. So Israel always gets caught in the middle of these wars between Assyria and Egypt. And he brought no present to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. Therefore the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. And the king of Assyria came up throughout all the land and went up to Samaria and besieged it 3 years. Now, it says here the siege is 3 years. And that would be what we would call inclusive reckoning. That is, you're taking a period, just like Jesus was in the grave for 3 years or 3 days. that symbol of 3 days is not necessarily 3 days. The symbol of 3 years is not 3 years. Now it says, in the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria took Samaria and carried Israel away into Assyria and placed them in Halah and in Habor by the river of Gozan and in the city of the Medes. So we first find out that the king of Israel, Hoshea, he's taken prisoner, and he's taken prisoner not at the end of the siege, but at the beginning of the siege. And you'll see a lot of commentators just dismiss what it says here in the Bible and just says, well, this doesn't really make sense. But actually, it does make sense when you understand this history. So I'll try to illustrate this here for you so you can see what I mean. So you have this, and I'm going to try to do the best I can of these years. It's not proportional or anything. Now, we're going to go over here. We're going to make this 721, 722, 723, 724, 725, 726, 727, 728. Now, so these are our years, and there's different solutions that have been done. We know that the northern kingdom is going to have their reigns going fall to fall. And we know that Judah most of the time has its reigns going spring to spring. And I've worked this out so many times in different ways, never really was satisfied with trying to understand exactly how this occurred. Because what I was always trying to do is I was trying to stagger the years of the reign. And I'm not sure if that's correct or not. But we do know that Hoshea is taken captive here. So we're going to take these as our years. So the spring would be here. So this is Hoshea's captivity. Now, we're going to put his years of his reign in here as well. And we're going to find that there's going to be a siege, and that siege is going to begin. And I'm just going to put this here as this is going to be years of, a spring to spring count, let's say. And then we're going to have that Samaria falls here. So here we're going to put Samaria falls. The siege ends. So a siege is going to be set up here. You're going to have the siege. And then Samaria is going to fall. And if we look at this, we would just call this 2 years. But since it happened at the end of one spring to spring year, and it happened at the beginning of another spring to spring year, this in inclusive counting, what they're doing is they're saying 3 years when they mean actually it's parts of 3 years. It doesn't even, you could even say this is 4 years if you really wanted to, depending on how you're counting. But it's going to be 3 years. So, and then when it says that it actually ends, we're going to see at the end of 3 years. And that word end does not mean the end of what we would think. It means one of the ends. So it's the end, what we would call the beginning. So at the beginning of the 3rd year is when the siege ends. Now, I'm not going to deal with all the archaeology that shows that this is when Samaria falls. We do know that Shalmaneser dies here in December, Shalmaneser V. He dies in December of 722, and then Sargon II comes to the throne, and Sargon II, in his records, shows that he carried them away in the spring of 721. And we can date it actually because there's when Assyria, when Shalmaneser V dies, Assyria actually splits into Syria and Babylon. And the king of Babylon, can't think of his name offhand, but he actually has a record of in his accession year. So at the time when Sargon II has his accession year, that there's these 2 eclipses of the moon in his accession and in the 1st year of his reign, which we can date this precisely. So we can know exactly when Sargon II began to reign, and then his 1st year of reign would have happened here in the spring, because his accession year is here. So we have this record, very accurate record that we can date this precisely. But most people just put it in 722 because they know Sargon V dies in 722 in December. And since Sargon V, or Shalmaneser V dies in December of 722 and Sargon II begins to reign. So they say, well, since Shalmaneser are the ones that's mentioned, that the captivity must have occurred under Shalmaneser. But it was actually finished by Sargon II. So when people use 722, what they're doing is they're just showing the point where Sargon or Shalmaneser V dies. So I know that maybe is a little bit hard to keep track of, but that's why people use 722. 723, of course, is the beginning of the siege, but it's also Hoshea's captivity. Now, what would happen, the reason why Hoshea is taken captive is when you have a siege, a nation comes up, they go around your city, you're in bad shape. And especially depending on the time of the year that it occurs. This would have occurred before the harvest, which was often a time, if it was convenient, you would like to have a siege before people have taken in their crops. One is you can come in and take the crops. So they might be nearly ready to harvest. You set up a siege. Your soldiers can then harvest those crops, and you can take that grain back to your city. So that's one of the things you're doing, is you're stealing their harvest. But also, your siege is going to be much shorter because those people are going to be starving in that siege. All the people have gone into the city. They're behind the walls. They do have usually emergency supplies, so they can stand to some degree the length of the siege. But if you come right after harvest, if you come in the summertime and they've already harvested, well, then you're going to have a much longer siege, and you're going to have to wait around longer, and you're not going to have as much food to feed your soldiers. So what a king would do in this situation, your city is surrounded, you're going to go out and meet the army and basically surrender. Just say, I'm sorry, I was wrong, I'm going to make up for it. I was under pressure. You can make all kinds of excuses why you had done this stuff with So, king of Egypt, or whatever you were doing wrong, why they're besieging you. Because normally they would besiege you, they start this protection racket. But the king would then go out. So Hoshea would have gone out, and we see the same thing later when Jehoiakim goes out at Daniel's captivity. He's allowed to remain king. So sometimes you go out, you apologize, you give them a bunch of gold, they're happy, they leave, and then your city is saved, and you're saved. But sometimes you're taken into captivity. And this is what happened with Hoshea. Now, Hoshea is taken into captivity, but he's not killed. At least, his years of reign go on. They don't have a new king. Even if he was killed, you wouldn't. They didn't have a new king put into place. Now, it was most likely what you do is you take this king captive, and you go through the siege, you destroy the city, and once the city's destroyed, you kill him, because what you want that king to see what he did wrong, the consequences of what he did wrong. You don't just kill him right away. So possibly Hoshea lived until after Samaria was taken captive. So those are the types of things that happen. Now, when we looked at this, it says in chapter 17, verse 6, and in the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria took Samaria. Now, there's this, so we know that it's in the 9th year of Hoshea. Whether he was alive or not doesn't really matter. But when we go to chapter 18, it goes back and it gives us more detail. Now it's talking about Hezekiah's reign. So the first one was talking about the reign of Hoshea and the things that happened. And now they're going to bring us under Hezekiah's reign. And it says, now it came to pass in the 3rd year of Hoshea, son of Elah, king of Israel, that Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, king of Judah, began to reign. 25 years old was he when he began to reign, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name also was Abi, the daughter of Zechariah. So one is he's 25 years old. Remember how I said that when Ahaz, in his first year of his reign, that Hezekiah was already born? So it didn't really make sense that the Jewish commentators would say that this virgin is going to give birth to Hezekiah, since he's already born. But this was referring to Manasseh. So anyway, 25 years old was when he began to reign. So he was like 4 or 5 years old when his dad became king. And it says he trusted in the Lord God of Israel, right? So we read about in 2 Chronicles when Hezekiah begins to reign, he cleans out the temple, sanctifies it, and invites northern Israel to a Passover. Doesn't mention that here in Kings. And then it says in verse 9, and it came to pass in the 4th year of Hezekiah, which was the 7th year of Hoshea, son of Elah, king of Israel, that Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up against Samaria and besieged it. And then here it says at the end of 3 years. So that word, the first one says they besieged it 3 years in chapter 7. But here they say at the end of 3 years. Now we use the word end to refer to something after it's past. But the Hebrew word here that's translated end could be either end. And in this case, it would have been at the end or the beginning of the 3rd year. So at the end of these 3 years, which is at the beginning. Even in the 6th year of Hezekiah. So if you think about it, it tells us a number of things. It tells us that the 4th year of Hezekiah was the 7th year of Hoshea. Now, this expression doesn't happen very often. Most of the time, when you're dealing with kings of Judah and kings of Israel, and they talk about the year, they'll say, in the year, this king began to reign. And that's true. This happens here. He begins to reign in a certain year of the reign of Hoshea. But the other thing that's interesting, it says that they're the same year. And I got to thinking about that. So if the 4th year is the 7th year, we would look at it like this. So we're going to just, we're going to go fall to fall now. So we have this fall to fall reign. Yeah, I need to change the board. Yes, thanks. So we have this fall to fall reign, and we know Hoshea is going to have this fall to fall reign. And we know this is going to be the 9th year, the 8th year, the 7th year, the 6th, 5th, the 4th, the 3rd, 2nd, etc. And this here is the 4th year. But if you look at this, there's trying to fit this to work. The only way I can really get it to work properly is to have, even though we have this spring to spring year that we're counting, we also have at the same time, I'll put it up here. This is the 4th year, the 5th year, the 6th year. So it tells us that the 4th year is the 7th year. It's not just that they overlap, but they're actually the same year. So this would mean that Hezekiah, so Hoshea is taken captive here, but Hezekiah, I'll put his reign up here. He's going to have the years of his reign fall to fall. Now we know that at some point, the kings of Judah moved from a spring to spring reign to a fall to fall. And with Zedekiah, they moved back to spring. But we don't know where. At least it doesn't tell us that. We know for certain that Josiah had a reign that was fall to fall. Now Josiah, he followed Ammon, who reigned for a brief time, and then he followed Manasseh. And I would think, so originally I would think, well, once Samaria fell, and Manasseh is such a wicked king, and he's worshiping the false religion of the northern kingdom, and also some of the elite priests and things like that may have actually escaped Samaria before the siege came. and actually went to Judah. It's possible. They can't prove that. But the point is that, I was pretty sure that Manasseh was probably going fall to fall, just as the northern kingdom did. But here, I started to think that maybe this actually happened even under Ahaz. It's possible, or even under Hezekiah. So not certain about it. It's just a speculation. But the thing is, to try to make this work, you can see if I'm going to have Hoshea in, and I'm going to have his reign going like this. So I'm going to have it staggered over as like a spring to spring reign. This would be the 6th year, the 5th year, the 4th year would be in the spring. And so for him to be taken captive, the siege beginning in the 4th year, which is the 7th year, it just doesn't seem to line up. But if I put them both as just, there's in a sense 2 different counts going. One is the fall to fall for the king's reign. The other is the count of the year itself, which is spring to spring. Not certain which way it works. But the point is, we can see that Hoshea and Hezekiah are contemporaries. So you got Hoshea's reign here. They're contemporaries. And that if the siege begins in the 7th year and it ends in the 9th year, there's no way that it could be actually 7 years or 3 years siege. It has to be what we would call 2 years, which they call in inclusive count 3 years. Makes much more sense, just because, but they're counting the years based upon this spring to spring calendar, but the king's reigns are in a fall to fall calendar. So most people don't think about these things. They don't try to go and work it all out. But this works out really well if the 7th year is the 4th year and the 9th year is the 6th year. Then we have no problem with it. It's a period of 2 years siege. They can start in the 7th and end in the 9th, or start in the 4th and in the 6th, but yet still start before the beginning of this year to make it 3 years. Because if you're starting here, to have it be 3 years, if you're starting here and ending here, you wouldn't actually call that 3 years. You would have to have this other part of a year to get your 3 years. And so at the end of 3 years, 1st year, 2nd year, 3rd year, at the end of the 3rd year, at the end of 3 years, or at the beginning of the 3rd year, however you want to look at it, you would sort of need that to happen. But again, I'm not adamant. It just seems to make the most sense. That was the last way I had worked it out. So to deal with 723, we have some facts. If we look up Sargon II and Shalmaneser V, we can date their reigns very precisely. And so we know when Samaria fell. And we also have the Bible telling us that there's this length of time of Hoshea and Hezekiah. And so I don't think we could have any problem trying to say that the 2520 for northern Israel began with the captivity of Hoshea in 723. There's just no other solution to the problem. There's not really any doubt. And that's a solid argument when you start to deal with that. Now, what people will say is that there's just, and we'll see this when we get to 677. So we're going to take a bit of a break. But when we get to Manasseh's captivity, they have this whole different chronology that they're using. So what they're doing is they're shortening the reign of the kings of Judah and Israel. So they have Israel end at the right time, but they don't even have Hoshea being king when Samaria falls, because they use Theo's chronology, and he doesn't have Hoshea begin to reign until 10 years after Samaria falls. And that's just crazy, because if you believe the Bible, you have to accept what it says. You can't pick and choose and say, well, an editor came and edited this. Once you've done that, you basically have dug yourself a hole that you're never going to get out of, because you can say you're defending the Bible by showing that it's wrong. Where do you end? So it's a big mistake that Theo made, and that's because he was trying to work this chronology in with his supposed Assyrian chronology. that also doesn't work and has been abandoned by most Assyriologists. But yet we still retain his chronologies of the kings of Judah in places like Wikipedia and the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So let's just take a little bit of a break. I'm going to pause the recording. And we'll come back in about 2 minutes. So we'll now look at 677. So we're going to look at Manasseh's captivity and the chronological problems, or they're really not problems, but just the way that people address 677. Now we talked about the fact that, and we'll look at this verse again. So it's in 2 Chronicles 33, verse 11. And so this is 2 Chronicles dealing with the reign of Manasseh and Manasseh's evil. He's the most wicked king in Judah. And then it says in verse 11, wherefore the Lord brought upon them the captains of the host of the king of Assyria, which took Manasseh among the thorns and bound him with fetters and carried him to Babylon. So this is an interesting point that the critics of the 2520 really sort of mess up in trying to discredit Manasseh's captivity. So let's draw this on the line now. So here you now have Manasseh's reign. So Manasseh, he's going to reign for a long time. Now, if you use Edwin Thiel's chronology, Manasseh begins to reign 10 or 11 years later than he actually did. Now, one of the arguments is it says in some old chronologies will say he was taken in the 22nd year of his reign, 677. So we're going to put it here, 677. But we're going to have this period of Esarhaddon as the king. Now, this is the only period of time that we have Babylon as part of the Assyrian Empire in the reign of Manasseh's period. So we could see, if we go earlier, when Assyria fell, Babylon actually split into Babylon, or Assyria split into Assyria and Babylon. And Esarhaddon's father, Sennacherib, I believe it was, he actually destroyed Babylon. And then what he did is he gave his son, Esarhaddon, Babylon sort of as his little city that he could have for himself. And Esarhaddon fell in love with Babylon and the Babylonian people. And he convinced his two brothers to kill his dad. And of course, they were found guilty for that. And so Esarhaddon then could take over the throne. And he did this, I believe it's in 681. So his reign begins in 681 BC. And it continues unto I think it's don't quote me on this, but I think it's 670. So I think it's 11 years, something like that, or 669. So Esarhaddon then, when he comes to the throne, he rebuilds the city of Babylon, and he makes it one of his capitals. And so the only time you have Babylon being a capital of Assyria is in this period of time. Now, what people will do is they say, well, Manasseh, 677, because they're going to have, this is really the 20th year of his reign. But they're going to say it's the 10th year of his reign. And so they're going to say it's way too early in his reign. Manasseh reigned for another 45 years, and that it's got to be way later that Manasseh was taken captive. Ellen White says that Manasseh was carried away to Babylon when Babylon was the temporary capital of Assyria. So she's placing it in Esarhaddon's reign. She knows that she's doing that because she knows the issues at the time regarding that. So she could have just plainly said, Manasseh was carried away to Babylon in 677 BC. She could have said that, and nobody would have had any problem with it in her day, because that's what they all believed. And they also understood it was under Esarhaddon's reign that occurred. So when she says it was when Babylon was the temporary capital of Assyria that Manasseh was taken captive, she's agreeing to this date. She also says that Manasseh was taken as an earnest of what was to befall Israel later. So she also connects his captivity with the events that are going to follow, with Daniel's captivity, with Jehoiachin's captivity, and Zedekiah's captivity, which we would call the 4 7 times, those events. So she ties it with that. Now, the other thing is that originally, before we had the Assyrian records, critics of the Bible would attack this as nonsense. They didn't know that Babylon had been the temporary capital of Assyria at any time. And the idea that the king of Assyria would carry Manasseh to Babylon seemed to them to be an anachronism of some sort. So that it just was out of place. Didn't make sense. Why would the king of Assyria carry Manasseh to Babylon? He's the king of Assyria. So until we had the archaeological records, there was often these criticisms attacked at the Bible about its inaccuracy as a historical document. Babylon's not connected with Assyria. But later on, we found that this was the case. And A.T. Jones writes about it. He writes about the fact that the scholars now, who once used to criticize, once they found documents that Babylon was the capital of Assyria for the period under Esarhaddon, that they then accepted it. But he said the fact that they accepted it based upon archaeology, but not because of the Bible, doesn't do them any favors. The reality is we need to accept it because the Bible says it, even if we don't have the evidence for it yet. I mean, obviously there was no evidence against it. There was just no record of it that anybody knew of until the late 1800s. So, even Miller wouldn't have known about that event specifically because they didn't have the Assyrian records at that time. So he just accepted the Bible without any kind of Assyrian records. Now, I think the Assyrian records, though, are important. I'm not saying that, I discount records, because records are nice things to have. They can help us nail things down more precisely. And what we have here is a thing called Prism B. So there's actually, this prism is a prism. It's like a four-sided sort of clay that has inscriptions on it, or markings on it. They're cuneiform writings on it, and that didn't work. Let's try this again. There we go. Is that going to work this time? Yeah. Now, Prism B is just, there's actually copies of them. The best preserved one is Prism B. And what I did here is I wrote it out in, there's various translations of it. So obviously it's in Assyrian. And I put my edition in square brackets. The round brackets are the translators. So when it says I, Esarhaddon, I put Esarhaddon there. It's Esarhaddon. In other parts of the document, he says he's Esarhaddon. And he wrote this, or dictated it, and he's talking about what he did. He's bragging about some of his exploits. He says, I, Esarhaddon, mustered. Now, the Assyrian word there is adkema. And some of the place will say, I called the kings of the county, or I summoned. But this word adkema, if you look through the Assyrian writings, it refers to the gathering of building materials, slaves, or armies. And the best way to translate it is mustered. So he didn't just call them to come. He actually had captains of the kings of Assyria go and take these kings and bring them. So it says, I, Esarhaddon, mustered the kings of the country of Hatti. Now the Hatti land is Palestine. And of the region on the other side of the river, referring to the Euphrates, that is, and he lists some of them: Balu, king of Tyre, Manasseh, king of Judah, and then it lists a bunch of other kings. They have complicated names. We don't really need to know them. But he lists some of them. And then he says, 12 kings from the seacoast, 10 kings from Cyprus, amidst the sea, together 22 kings of Hatti, the seashore and the islands. All these I sent out. Now I put in brackets, from Babylon with a question mark. So he's mustered them all, brought them together, 22 kings, and now he's going to send them out. The question is, from where? Well, we know where he sends them out, to, and made them transport under terrible difficulties to Nineveh, the town where I exercise my rulership, so that's one of his capitals, as building materials for my palace. Big logs, long beams, and thin boards from cedar and pine trees, products of the Syria and Lebanon mountains, right? And so he goes through and lists all these materials. And I'm just going to finish off this quote here. It's on the bottom of the next page. I think. Nope, doesn't. That was it. So it just kind of gets cut off there. So he transports these things under difficult conditions, right? It says, under terrible difficulties. So they're going to transport logs. Now the question is, why would he do this? Why would he take and gather these 22 kings together and bring them to Babylon and then send them out to haul timbers, to work as slaves, for his palace in Nineveh? Now, so the question is why? First off, he's just rebuilt Babylon. One of the things that we see about the kings of Assyria is they're very proud, and they want to show their power to the kingdoms around them, to these kings that are paying them tribute, because they want to make sure that you're paying this money for protection. First off, the king of Babylon is going to protect you. But also, you better not rebel against him, because you're not going to survive. So this is why he's doing this. Now, when we look at Manasseh is a wicked king. And now he is brought into this difficult situation where now he's working as a slave. And it's at this point that he calls out to God, and God delivers him. He's returned back to Jerusalem. He's a changed man. He does all kinds of building projects. Now, he's still not the greatest king in the world. He's not as good as some of the other kings of Judah, but he's definitely tempered his evil. Now, Ellen White says that this conversion doesn't come soon enough because his son is affected by it. Now, his son isn't born till later, but his son is not directly affected because he saw his dad do it. It's this false worship. It's because this false worship had become so prevalent in Judah that his son was also affected by it. So his conversion, if it had happened sooner, maybe at the beginning of his reign, he had followed like Hezekiah, then we would have had a different situation. But he did reign for 55 years. And so he'd reigned for 20 years. And because of his conversion, I believe God allowed him to reign for a long, long time. So one is, we have this record. And other people argue that Manasseh was not taken captive until years later, near the end of his reign. Well, we have the record of this, and this record is under the period of Esarhaddon. And most scholars place this document in 677 BC. I've seen a couple who place it in 676. So it's not like we can date this document exactly to the year, with 100% accuracy, but we know that it happened under this period of time, 677, 676. I think I might even have found one who put it a little bit earlier, 678. And they're basing this on all the history that happens that they have regarding Esarhaddon. So here we have the document. This, to me, there should be no dispute regarding 677 for the captivity of Manasseh. We have the history, we have the document, but I've asked some people if you were going to choose a year in which the captivity did not happen, what year would you choose that he was not taken to Babylon? And they would say 677, because their argument is this is the king of Assyria, and he would have taken them to Nineveh. We know he was in Assyria, not Babylon. But the document does not say where in the Assyrian Empire he was taken. I'm saying that it was in Babylon for the very reason he just rebuilt Babylon. And that would be the logical place to take these kings. He's going to show them the city he just built, and then he's going to have them work as slaves to go back and start his work on Nineveh, which he did next. And we know that historically that's what happened, that he first rebuilt Nineveh or Babylon and then moved to do work in Nineveh. So it makes no sense, but people will argue because it doesn't say he was taken to Babylon specifically, that means he wasn't. And of course, that's not a logical argument at all. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. But also, if you look at this logically, you would have to say that that's where he was taken. But then you'd also have to argue that there are two captivities of Manasseh, and it's only the second one that happened, another 25, 30 years, 35, 40 years later, however late you want to try to make it. But it's also the time when Babylon is not the capital of Assyria. They're completely different empires. Now, they try to make an argument that what ended up happening is one of the sons of Esarhaddon, he ended up rebelling, and or grandsons. It's one of the sons or grandsons. He ended up rebelling, and he was a king of Babylon, so he became a king of Babylon. But he's not a king of Assyria. So you couldn't have 2 Chronicles 33:11 saying that the king of Syria brought him to Babylon. You'd have to say the king of Babylon brought him to Babylon. So there's just, to me, this argument's insuperable. I don't know why anybody would argue against it, except that there are some people who don't want to believe the 2520. And anything that supports the 2520, they will never concede to. So I've dealt with people like this. So you're not going to convince somebody who has their mind set against it. But this is a very good document. And it's nice to see, you can, just from a biblical point of view, that you can see in the Assyrian records mention made of Manasseh. So, I would believe it even if I didn't have this document, but definitely you can't argue against it when you do. Now, so in trying to get through this prophetic mirror, I dealt with some of these things. I'm just looking through my notes here. And I'm going to address this side of it now. So the times of the Gentiles. Now, if you read Hiram Edson's paper on the 2520 that he published in 7 years before 1863, I think. 56, yeah. I was just trying to do the math there. So in 1856, and it's there's 7 articles that are published, I believe, and he never did finish it. But what he argued is that the 2 desolating powers were the times of the Gentiles. So this period here is divided into 2 1260s. And that this is paganism, and this is papalism. And it's definitely a very insightful a way of looking at this history. Because Jesus talks about the times of the Gentiles, they have to be fulfilled. And the fact is, it's times. But also, that word times ties us to something else. It ties us to Daniel's prophecy. So Daniel chapter 12, first here, Daniel 7, verse 25, has times and a half, and so does Daniel 12, verse 7. But Daniel 12, verse 7 is referring to the scattering of the power of the holy people. And so we know that in 538, this is a period of time that Babylon, well, really it started with Assyria, Babylon, Media, Persia, Greece, and Rome. But of course, you've got Rome pagan, and then you got Rome papal here. So for 1260 years, you have this desolating power. And it's going to start, though you could argue that Assyria actually came against Israel earlier. So why would we choose the 723 BC date? Well, that's because of Leviticus 26. It's the breaking of the pride of the power, the captivity of Hoshea, that's going to start this period. And we also have this one. This is Miller's 2520. But Miller did not ignore this period. He actually took it into account. So he started, I think he used the year 722, if I remember correctly. And then he would count all the way up to 1798. No, actually, I think he would go back here. I don't think he took this date. I think he started in 677. And he would then use Babylon, Media, Persia, Greece, and Rome. But he would have this period taken off of his 2520. So he had this one for Israel. I think he talked about this, though. He talked about the 2520 years. I'm trying to remember how he did it. I can't think of how he looked at this. He recognized this, but he focused on this. Let's just put it that way. But there was something else that he did. Yes. He moved things here. That's what he did, is he took 1798 out of here. And I can't remember. I should know that better, how he looked at these two together. So anyway, he did see this period of time, and he did see this period of time, but he only took this as the 2520 from Leviticus 26. This period of time here, he just thought it was interesting or convenient that this occurs, but he didn't focus on this. He didn't really, I can only find one place where he specifically mentions it. So we have these two 2520s. Hiram Edson says, well, this is the correct one, this one's wrong. Miller says, well, this is really the correct one. This one's just not important. But both of them have to go together, as we can see here. Now, when you have paganism and papalism as the two desolating powers, this is one of the principles that Miller understood that led him to understand the 2300 days. Because he understood in Daniel 8 that when it says how long, that period of time had already begun. And the 2300 days refers to a period that's going to start in the future. So Miller understood that in Daniel chapter 8, the 2520 was being referred to. So he didn't just dismiss this, but he saw this as the main 2520 because he's dealing with Jerusalem. And I'm not sure why he didn't see this, other than that God just hid it from him, or why Hiram Edson didn't see this, that they fit together. Because I would not have rejected this. I would have said, well, we have this, but we also have this. I mean, that's what, maybe it's easy to say. But, it just seems to me that there was no reason to reject this. But especially as a Seventh-day Adventist, because you already saw that the 2300 days, and Ellen White talks about the prophetic periods were correct, and they believed the prophetic periods were correct. So James White still believed this 2520. So when Hiram Edson introduced this, I don't see why he would just then say it's one or the other. But we often do that, you know. Sometimes people think when we're presenting the 2520 that we're discounting the 2300 days, right? It's almost like it's an either or. You have to pick one or the other. To me, they just, really would go together. And Ellen White quotes Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28. And she says that the Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28 were fulfilled partially in the period of the judges, but their complete fulfillment was met with the captivity of Israel in Assyria and the captivity of Judah in Jerusalem, or in Babylon. So the captivity of Babylon was a fulfillment of Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28 for Judah, and the captivity in Assyria was the fulfillment of Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28. So, to me, this is clear. Now, of course, Ellen White understood that. In 1863, she hadn't written that yet, but she still continued to understand that these two lines exist. And so we're saying we stretch the line of Samaria over the line of Jerusalem. And so we're putting line upon line. And so once we do that, we see this structure. So this is the structure of the prophetic mirror. Now we can see at the beginning, we have this civil war. And I believe it was in 2012 when I first seen this presented. It wasn't presented as detailed as this. But here we have a civil war, and now we're going to have the North and the South, but the South is going to be Confederate. So the South is going to be Confederate, where here it's the North. And so you can see this mirror aspect, that in the mirror it's the same thing, but it's reversed. So here we're going to have the 19 years, and here we're going to have the 19 years. And then we're going to have the 65 years here and the 65 years here. Now we can also divide this here, it's 46 years, and we can do the same thing here. We can put 46 years here in this one. So we're going to divide that 65 years in this way. Now I remember when I first saw this, I didn't like it from a numbers point of view. I like the 46, but I didn't like the 65, and I didn't understand the 69 or the 19. When I first started studying this would be 2012. It just didn't seem, the numbers didn't seem right to me. I couldn't understand them. And I spent a lot of time trying to understand what was the reasons behind these numbers, because to me, numbers are symbolic. You got this 2520, you got the 21260s. The 46 even I could accept, but the 65 years, I couldn't make heads nor tails of it. And until I started to really analyze this structure. So one of the first things I did is I recognized that there's actually 65 plus 19 to make the whole length of the period. That is, in order to look from here to here, I have to add 84 years to 2520 to get the whole length of the period. And this means that the whole prophetic mirror is 2,604 years. So I remember the week I figured this out. And I went to our Bible study group and I presented this. And it was a bit more complicated than this. There was a bunch of other things that I was doing. I was working the 2,300 days in here in different ways. I was dealing with all these different prophetic periods, the 2,300 days, which is, 220 years shorter than the 2520. I even dealt with the Jubilee, 2,450 years. I had them all laid out. But this was the thing that really impressed me, was this 2,604 years. And I'm going to just show you what I found with it. But I remember when at the end of the study, the guys whose house the study was at, the whole time he had this sort of smile on his face, as I was presenting. And I thought, Does he think I'm wrong? What's he thinking? I'd look at him, and he just had this funny expression on his face. So at the end of the study, he said, "Come here. Look what I did this week." And he had figured this out as well. And that was really, to me, a confirmation that I was on the right track, that we found something at the same time, independently, but through God's Spirit. Now, the thing that I found out about this 2,604 years, is I came to recognize that this is on the 1843 chart, but in a hidden way. And it's also on the 1863 chart. So in dealing with the prophetic mirror, I'm just going to finish off this before I look at this. We know that we have this civil war in the spring. And so we have this civil war, not in the spring, but in the beginning. And we have the civil war in the fall. Now, this civil war is the reason that the Seventh-day Adventist Church organized. So here they're going to become a people. That is, here, not a people would mean they're not, that this is referring to a denomination, right? A group of people. So they become a people, or denominated, which means they're named. And then it says they're going to be established. So this is the establishment of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So it's a mirror of what's being talked about here. And they're in the land of Israel, but the promised land, which is America. So this is literal over here. This is spiritual. So you have this literal and this spiritual land and people. So these are the Protestants, Protestant America, and it's the land of, and that's where God is going to establish his church, which is the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So they become the Seventh-day Adventists. Officially, they're established church organization. So you have this mirror at the beginning and at the end. Now we have another thing that happens in 1863, and there's a couple of charts made in 1863. So hopefully you can see that there. One is the Ten Commandments, and the other is the 1863 chart. So the Ten Commandment chart and the 1863 chart go together. Now, when these came out, Joseph Bates, he refers to a verse, write it on a table and note it in a book. Now, there's also a book that goes along with these tables, and that book is the key to the prophetic chart. So you're going to have a book. We'll just write it as a book like this, and that's the key. So the key to the prophetic chart is given. Now, it's interesting that in that book, it affirms 677. And a lot of people will make a big deal about the fact that the 1863 chart does not have the 2520 on it. But of course, it doesn't have the 1260. Neither does it have the 1290, the 1335. So it's not a compendium of everything that Adventists believe prophetically. It's a chart used to do evangelistic series as a visual aid. And instead of having the writing on it, like we had with these other charts, they chose just to put the pictures from the 1850 chart on the 1863 chart. Now they reversed them, flipped them over. Not certain why they did that. There's probably a good reason logistically in making it. It's probably easier to do some kind of impression. They used the original 1850 chart to get those pictures, I would believe. But anyway, so they have the 1863 chart. Now the 1863 chart has the 2520 on it. It's just that it's hidden. And it's in the same corner that the 1843 chart is in. So I'm just going to point up here on the 1843 chart. So on the 1843 chart, you can see in this top corner is the 2520. And it's written in two different ways. Now, in the very corner, we have this calculation, 721 and 84, and then 30, and then 2520. So I'm going to deal with this and show you what I mean. So what they have on the 1843 chart, I guess I'll do this first. So you have 7, 12, and so they take the number of years, so which is a sabbatical cycle, and they take, there's 12 months in a year to get 84 months, and then they multiply this by 30 days to the month to get 2520 days, which represents 2520 years. So that's how they did this calculation. And it took me a while. I did find that this calculation exists in one of the papers, but it wasn't something that they usually used. And I'm not sure why they used this calculation, but I felt it was providential. So when the hand was held over the corner of that chart to block out the wrong date, 1843, it exists in the 2520 and the 2300 days. It also would have, the hand would have covered this calculation. Now, I noticed that on the 1863 chart, that it had the week of Christ. So the week of Christ, it has it like this. It has the cross without Jesus on the cross, where the 43 and the 50 chart have him on the cross. And then it says 3.5, 3.5. So this is the times, and the dividing of times, the times, and a half that are expressed here in, so I'd say this is Daniel 7, if you're going to look up here, and this is Daniel, or this is Daniel 12:7, this is Daniel 25, or 7:25. You could put those half years in here. But we know that this is talking not about this counterfeit of this, but this is talking about the true curse. Jesus Christ is crucified in the midst of the week. He's confirming the covenant. And now when you look at this, and you think back even to Genesis chapter 15, where you have the animals, you know, there's 3 animals and the dove, and 3 animals, the other half of the 3 animals and a pigeon on either side here of this covenant, when the covenant is cut in half. And they're 3 years old, each of them, but a turtle dove and a young pigeon. And I think this definitely does represent or relate to this week, the number 3 being used on either side. And they're being cut in half, so the halves, but also just thinking of the birds sort of as the animals represent the 3s, the 3 years represent the 3s, but then the turtle dove and the young pigeon, which aren't cut in half, are put on either side, so they would represent the halves. At least that's the way I would sort of think of it. But anyway, this is the week of Christ, the 70th week, the covenant week. Now, we know that 3.5 years is also 42 months. And we also know that it's 1,260 days. So we also know that this is 2520. So the 2520 is on the 1863 chart, but it's hidden in the week of Christ. But then I noticed something else, and it's these 42 months. That what I have here is 84 months. And that they're divided by 31 AD. So this is the midst of the week. And so I thought about this calculation here. I seen this number 84, and I knew that that was the difference between the 2520 and 2,604 years. So I did this with the chart. I got rid of the 1, the 3, or 0, and put a 1 to represent 31 AD, and then found that if I multiplied this, it's 2,604 years, which is in 1863, which is on the 1863 chart, is the whole period of time from when the prophetic mirror begins. So that this chart in 1863 that was made, it was a witness against them, what they were doing in neglecting the 2520. And so this 2,604, I could then say, this is not chance, this is actually providential, because it connects with this. Another way that I looked at it, though, was I could take these same numbers. It says in Daniel chapter 9 that he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. Now, the number of the covenant is 12. You know, the 12 sons, the 12 disciples, and the week, of course, is 7. So he shall confirm the covenant for 1 week, so that's 7 weeks. And then, or 1 week is 7 years, pardon me. And then in the midst of the week, so this would be the midst of the week, he shall cause sacrifice and oblation to cease. So I could just look at this calculation that they had, switch this from a 0 to a 1, and I could see that it represents the whole prophetic mirror, just doing it that way as well. So I could take this 84 as representing the 84 months, but I could also take each of these symbols here as representing Daniel chapter 9, verse 26. So that, to me, this was the convincing argument for me regarding the prophetic mirror. It convinced me of the 2520 because I understood that the probability that you would have this occur was extremely unlikely, and it was just too providential, because it explains so many things about Adventism, to reject this prophetic mirror. And when I've shown this to people, some people have come out of all different kinds of errors within Adventism by seeing this and recognizing that God has, he supports, or this supports Adventism at its foundation, but it also removes a lot of fanaticism when it's looked at properly. Now, we know there's a lot of groups who believe the 2520. Most groups now who believe the 2520 don't accept this 2520. They only accept this one. They're kind of Millerite, historic Adventists. They accept a lot of errors that Miller had. They don't accept this. They see it as a distortion of this message that was given to Adventism. Ellen White never taught it in their minds, so they just ignore it. They think it's something that, FFA is teaching, but it's error. And so they don't accept this. So this is something that this movement owns, this prophetic mirror. It's not a part of other groups who believe the 2520. And when the 2520 is usually attacked, it's this one that's attacked. They don't even try to deal with the prophetic mirror or for the one for Northern Israel. Because this one becomes really powerful because you can show it, as we're going to, we tried to do, by looking at the story of Joseph and showing that we could create this mirror without this one. We could just create this by taking the story of Joseph and creating that, dividing this up into 5 times 252, and then from the end of the 70 weeks, 2 times 252, right? So we have that whole chain of 252s. Which we did. So this becomes then, this whole prophetic mirror in this way is very different from the way that other people would do it. It's different from the way I can form it a different way. But here we're just looking at this whole picture. And I think it becomes very convincing. We can see that this structure is, all these symbols point to this idea that in 1863, when the Seventh-day Adventist Church becomes a church, this 1863 chart shows that even though they're rejecting some light, that God is still hiding that light to later reveal. So now, dealing with 1863 itself, the 1863 chart, we've often looked at it as a bad chart. Now, there's nothing wrong with the 1863 chart that I can tell. I don't think it has any error on it. The only thing is that there are things that are hidden on it. And of course, even the booklet itself has no problems with it. Ellen White doesn't condemn it. She actually endorses its use. She doesn't give it the same endorsement that she does with the 1843 and the 1850 chart, in that they're fulfillments of Habakkuk. But, Joseph Bates, when he saw the chart, he had an argument which was written in, I believe it is in the Review and Herald. He wrote a letter to James White, and the verse that he used, let's see if I can find it here. It's Isaiah 30. So let's turn there. Give you the thumb again. Now, it's an interesting passage because there's a lot about it. You know, if you read the whole context, not to go down to Egypt. But he says that he thinks that the 1863 chart is a fulfillment of this verse. Now go, write it before them in a table and note it in a book, that it may be for the time to come forever and ever. That this is a rebellious people, lying children, children that will not hear the law of the Lord, which say to the seers, see not, and to the prophets, prophesy not unto us right things, speak unto us smooth things, prophesy deceits. Get you out of the way, turn aside out of the path, cause the Holy One of Israel to cease from before us. Wherefore thus saith the Lord, the Holy One of Israel, behold, ye despise this word, and trust in oppression and perverseness, and stay thereon. Therefore this iniquity shall be to you as a breach ready to fall, swelling out in a high wall, whose breaking cometh suddenly in an instant. So it's a very interesting passage. The idea, you know, the seers see not, to the prophets prophesy not unto us right things. Now Joseph Bates tries to look at it positively, and it's hard to tell in the conversation that he has with James White, because he writes the letter, and James White responds and says, we think that Joseph Bates' interpretation is apocryphal, so he doesn't agree with it. They're friends, and I think Joseph Bates is sort of chiding him. He's like, I don't understand why you need this new chart, why it's not doesn't got some of the things on it like the 2520, because Joseph Bates, as far as I can tell, he believed the 2520 to his death, and it seems that James White actually did as well. There's no evidence that he rejected the 2520. The article attributed to him was most likely written by Uriah Smith. James White was not at the review at the time. His son had just died in 1863, and so there's a January 1864 article in the review that in the E.G. White Bible program, whatever it's called, that just gives it as James White wrote it, but that's just because he officially was the editor. It doesn't actually give the author for the article, and Uriah Smith at the time was actually acting as editor while James White was grieving the loss of his son and traveling with Ellen White. So anyway, and there's also the language of it and the quote from Gesenius, which James White does not do, which Uriah Smith always does. So the appeal to Hebrew, which James White would not have done if he had written an article. Things like that, that show that it probably wasn't James White that wrote it. It's not in his style of writing. It's in Uriah Smith's style of writing. But the point is, a lot of people just believe that James White wrote it, so you might not argue against them. But what you can see is that Joseph Bates himself, he questioned the 1863 chart, that it seemed that they were moving away from their understanding of prophecy in the way that the chart was made. So, I mean, he may not have been like seriously concerned, but he definitely saw that, we're changing what we're teaching. So he saw that in the 1863 chart. I think that's what it tells us. So we have this prophetic mirror. It's a very powerful part of our message. And without it, I don't know that I would have understood Ezekiel, Millerite history. There's so many things that this was dependent. We needed to get this understood before we could understand other truths. the 2520 is not our message per se. It's Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45. That's the message that this movement is about. But of course, many people came into this movement with the 2520 because it was something that was actually very convincing. One thing it shows is it shows that Adventism was laid with a proper foundation, that we should not be ashamed of Millerite history, that there's lots of light hidden that God is now revealing, and that there's a structure in prophecy that we had not seen. And so what I did, once I started to understand these ideas, is I spent most of my time studying the Old Testament prophecies, the chronologies, trying to get things in their proper place. And that's how we eventually found Ezekiel 4, verse 4 to 6, that was connected to the prophecy of Josiah. And it was really the 2520 that unlocked it, because it unlocked the chronology. It made so that we could actually see where the periods were. It also helped us understand the calendars, because there's so many things that we had to look into to understand this. So once we understood Ezekiel, we could understand Millerite history better. And this movement, even before I was just studying separate things, chronology, sort of with one ear to the ground, so to speak, seeing that everything I was studying related to what was being understood in this movement. So to me, the prophetic mirror is something that we should be able to show to people. Now, the first way that I showed it to people, I think, is the best way to show it to Adventists who are skeptical. Because one is, you're not actually showing them the 2520 at first. You're showing them the 21260s. And you're doing it by connecting it to the story of Joseph, where you establish the idea of a chiasm. And that idea of a chiasm then can then be related to the structure that we see in using the 70 weeks and the 1260 days. You can easily go back and start that 21260s. And then you connect it to the week of Christ. So part of it is that you're focusing with the cross as being the center of all prophecy. And that Jesus' cross is his week is counterfeited by these two desolating powers, paganism and papalism. So when you start to approach things in that way, one is you're laying a foundation of how to study. You're showing that Adventism is solid. You're not using a lot of speculative theories, where a lot of Adventists, they're listening to the prophecies out there by other churches. And you're bringing things to them that make sense as a Seventh-day Adventist. So if somebody who's a Seventh-day Adventist who studied and who knows the 70 weeks and the 1260 years, when they see the structure there and they see the relationship to the story of Joseph, and we know that Joseph typifies Christ, they're both sold for money, they both have the period of 30 years. There's lots of other symbolisms that people have noticed as Seventh-day Adventists between those histories. We can also take the story of what happens with the 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine. We can relate those to the Sunday law. We can draw that story on a line, but we can show people this structure as well, and shows that the 2520 that Miller had and the 2520 that Hiram Edson proposed are tied together in this structure. And it shows to me that the Seventh-day Adventist Church, its establishment in 1863, is a fulfillment of prophecy. That it's not just something that happened. There's also a whole bunch of history dealing with the Civil War that we now have light on. Ellen White's Civil War visions, all these types of things. They open up the door to looking at prophecy in a new way. So the 2520 was this key. And so I suggest that, if you've never drawn out this 2520 prophetic mirror, that you practice doing it. And you can show it to people. I've done it in 20 minutes on a napkin. I've shown it to guitar students at university, who are Christians, a Lutheran university that I used to teach at. Some of them accepted it as they just said, this makes a lot of sense, even though they're not Adventists. The one student was, he actually went to Germany to visit his relatives. Half of them were Lutheran and the other half were Seventh-day Adventists, which he found really interesting. So there's lots that can be done with this. And when in the next class, We're going to go over the joining of the two sticks, and we're going to start to look now at our time and to understand this. So these are the two sticks are joined in this way. To me, putting over the line of Jerusalem over the line of Samaria, or the line of Samaria over the line of Jerusalem, is the joining of the two sticks in a different sort of way than we could see. But we're also going to see that at the end of these two things come together. We're going to have to look at Millerite history, and we're going to have to look at our history to understand that. So any final questions? Anybody have any comments or questions?
I hadn't heard of Joseph Bates' letter. Is it in your notes? I can't find it.
It's not in my notes here. I have them in some of my other notes. But if you type up the 1863 chart or the chart, and it's in 1863 in the Review and Herald, so you don't have to search through all Ellen G. White's writings disc. You can just look at 1863 Review and Herald and search up Brother Bates.
Do you mind, in case somebody else needs it, do you mind emailing it out?
Yeah, I'll email the statement out, Joseph, because it is interesting.
And James White's letter too.
So James White's, well, yeah, so it's in the Review and Herald, his response to Joseph Bates.
Yeah, I see James White. I have that one bookmarked, but I don't, just in case somebody else needs it.
Oh, you mean you mean the article attributed to him?
His denying of the 2520, like that they said it was James White that wrote the rejection of the 2520.
January 26th.
I know it starts in January 26, 1844, JWE ARSH 68.2. I know that's where James White's letter starts.
Yeah, 1863, 64. Yeah, 1864. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, 1864, but the paragraph is 68.2.
Yeah, yeah.
In the Advent Review and Sabbath Herald.
Yeah, and there's another fellow who did a whole research on this of what happened. One of the reasons he says that later James White signed his articles. At that time, he wasn't signing any articles. And there was a lot of anonymous articles, or the editor would write an article, but they weren't signed. And so the suggestion is because at the time, even though on the masthead it has James White, Uriah Smith was actually the editor that month. And so Uriah Smith wrote the article. But again, they didn't have the habit of putting their name on it. You just, it was a small community, so you knew that Uriah Smith wrote it. But later on, when the E.G. White disc came out, it was just anytime James White's name was the editor, any articles that weren't attributed to anybody else are always attributed to James White on the disc. But there's no evidence that I can find that he wrote it. The evidence would be that he did not write it. Until somebody can show me, that he wrote it, I would say that he didn't. And it just appears to be Uriah Smith's arguments. So it doesn't really make much sense. And there's no evidence that James White, because we know later he still did accept the 2520. So it would make no sense that he would have changed his mind. So we have another book where he writes about William Miller and the prophecies, and he affirms the prophetic periods and even quotes regarding the 2520 and just puts it in there as if it's truth. Doesn't say, this is some error that we rejected. So it doesn't really make sense that he would have rejected the 2520. But I can put those in an email and send them to people. And any other comments?
Thank you.
Okay, well, you're welcome.
Yeah, thanks. I can't wait to get that proof too about James White. And I was thinking maybe he wasn't signing things. I mean, this might sound stupid, but perhaps his stroke, paralyzed his right arm for a while.
No,
I'm presuming his right hand.
No, after that, they started signing his articles. So he would sign his articles later on. But at that time, they weren't signing articles. Because it was a small community. When you send out the Review and Herald, it's to church members. Everybody would know who wrote what article.
Okay.
So it was just, once they started, I guess it was disputed who was writing articles. And so then later on, the articles are signed by James White. if he wrote it. But there's no evidence that he wrote the article. But for a lot of people, they just accept that, he was the editor, so he must have. They don't really think about it. So, but it's easy to show that he didn't write it, that it's not his language, and that he doesn't quote from Gesenius. He doesn't use Hebrew. Uriah Smith always liked to use Gesenius, who was a Hebrew lexicographer. He liked using him to support his arguments. James White never did. So it's clear it's Uriah Smith.
More for me to look into because I didn't know all this.
Yeah.
Sorry, I've got one.
Okay.
When you mentioned the northern Israel from 723 BC, that part, when you mentioned, I think you said that it represents sort of Protestants, and the bottom of the other one's the SDA one. Is there any supporting on that, or did I misunderstand?
So you're asking, I didn't quite catch your question. You're asking about the northern Israel.
Yeah, when you were mentioning northern Israel, I think you mentioned that kind of represented also the Protestant side of. Yeah.
So the argument that we would have is that it's a two-horned power. They build a golden calf in Dan and in Bethel. Dan means judge. Bethel means house of God. So that's church and state, right? The state, the judge, Bethel, the church. And it's also the false prophet. Right? So it's a false worship, and it's 25:20. It's judged, and it's scattered and never to be gathered. There's no northern 10 tribes scattered around the world. Right. They've incorporated into the nations around them. There's British Israelism, where they try to argue that the people in Ireland are Danites and so forth. And the coronation stone is some stone that was carried from Jerusalem, when the Israelites, or from Israel when the Israelites were scattered. There's all kinds of theories around that. So we know northern Israel is no more. So in the New Testament, when they write to the tribes scattered abroad, I can't remember, it's the 10 tribes scattered abroad. It's just a metaphorical sense. God's people are scattered. So there isn't a literal 10 tribe. But in 1798, you have to have a gathering. So you have the scattering that happens at the beginning, but they're now gathered because it's the times of the Gentiles. So the Gentiles are the Protestants. They're the Christians, and they're going to go through a reform line. And in that reform line, some of those people are going to become God's denominated people, Judah. So what this reform line is about, besides other things, it's about establishing God's denominated people again. And the Protestants, they have two horns, right, church and state, and one horn falls in the Millerite period, that is the church. They become part of Babylon. And in our history, the second horn falls, and that's the state, republicanism. So republicanism and Protestantism. And it's at that point, as we're going to see in the joining of the two sticks, that the true Protestants are going to join this movement and Seventh-day Adventists in standing for the Sabbath in opposition to Sunday legislation. Yeah. And that to me, so I kind of went ahead of what the joining of the two sticks is going to be about. But that's why we're going to look at Millerite history and understand what happened there. The two groups, Protestants and Millerites, and Samuel Snow and his role. And then in our history, the two groups, that we're going to look at, which is basically the Seventh-day Adventist Church, the church and the world, if you want to put it in that broader term, and the role that the different groups or the different lines that we have in our history, how they fit together. So if you don't understand that the Protestants, the false prophet, is a continuation of northern Israel. It's northern Israel. Again, it's worship that's Christian, but it's still not the true worship because they're keeping Sunday still. So they're affected by the woman, the wicked woman, Babylon.
Yeah.
The
Now, thank you for explaining that. Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks. So if there's no other questions, we can kneel for prayer. Okay. Dear Father in heaven, thank you for the study that we had here today. There's many things that we have to learn. And in rehearsing through this history, Lord, I know that you are making things clearer for us. And mostly, Lord, I ask that you can help us to explain this to others, that we can show them these things, and that they can see them very clearly, that your Holy Spirit can always work upon the hearts of those around us, and that your angels can always go before us and prepare the way. We pray for Seventh-day Adventists, for this church. We pray for this movement. We pray for the people who are seeking you. And we ask, Lord, that you can use us. Thank you for the truth of the 2520, something that we sort of take for granted in this movement, but that if we can remember that when we first saw these things, how our faith was revived, we ask, Lord, that we can show it to others so that their faith can be revived, that they can be strengthened for the time ahead. Help us to warn others of what's coming upon this earth, and to be servants of yours in giving this message of mercy to the world. And we thank you and we praise you in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, thanks everyone, especially for those questions at the end. Good questions.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you too. I've been sharing this with a little bit with one of my girls who just opposed everything, even months ago. She was comparing Christ to all these pagan gods, you know, and she was into really weird occult stuff. And now she's open, like she was really listening. I could feel her wanting to hear more. And she finally said, "Mom, I know the truth. I'm the smart one." I thought, maybe because she's hearing about the spiritual stuff as well as what's going on now. And I said, our only hope is to cling